The morning of August 11th, 1943, 32,000 feet above the industrial heart of Germany, Second Lieutenant Robert Shaffer pushed his P-38H Lightning into a steep dive. Below him, a Messerschmitt Bf 109 was attempting to escape toward a low cloud deck. Shaffer's twin Allison engines screamed as airspeed climbed past 300 miles per hour. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. 320, 340. At 360 miles per hour indicated airspeed. He felt it, a tremor in the control column. 380. The tremor became violent shaking, the nose tucked under, steepening his dive beyond anything he'd intended. Shaffer hauled back on the control wheel. Nothing. The controls felt, as he would later write in his mission report, like they were encased in concrete. The Messerschmitt grew smaller, pulling away effortlessly in the dive Shaffer could not follow. He was approaching terminal velocity with controls completely locked, plummeting toward German soil in an aircraft that had cost American taxpayers $60,000 and would cost him his life, unless physics intervened before the ground did. Shaffer survived, barely. As his Lightning descended through 15,000 feet, the thicker air gradually restored control authority. He recovered at 9,000 feet, 3 miles lower than when his dive began. The Messerschmitt was long gone. That night, intelligence officers recorded another instance of what had become the P-38's defining operational limitation in the European theater. German fighter pilots had discovered what American engineers were still struggling to understand. The Lightning, despite being America's fastest operational fighter at 414 miles per hour in level flight, could not dive. This technological paradox would shape aerial combat over Europe for nearly 2 years. The fastest fighter in the Allied arsenal was also, in the realm of high-speed dives, the slowest. German pilots knew this. American pilots died discovering it. And the solution, when it finally arrived in the summer of 1944, would come too late to change the Lightning's reputation in Europe, though it would fundamentally alter the physics of high-speed flight. This is the story of how America's most futuristic fighter became obsolete in one specific, crucial maneuver, before engineers even understood what was killing their pilots. It is the story of compressibility, that invisible barrier between subsonic and supersonic flight that claimed lives at a rate no enemy pilot could match. And it is the story of dive recovery flaps, small hydraulic panels that solved a problem the Luftwaffe didn't know had been solved, maintaining a tactical advantage that existed only in German minds long after American engineering had erased it from reality. The P-38 Lightning entered design competition in 1936, when the concept of compressibility belonged to theoretical physicists, not combat pilots. Lockheed engineer Clarence Kelly Johnson and his team conceived a twin-engine, single-seat interceptor to meet Army Air Corps specifications, demanding 400 miles per hour at 20,000 feet, a rate of climb reaching that altitude in 6 minutes, and endurance at that speed of 1 hour. The specifications described an aircraft that would fly faster than any American fighter had ever flown, into a regime of aerodynamics where no practical data existed. Johnson, holding a master's degree from the University of Michigan, understood the theoretical risks. Compressibility, the phenomenon where air begins behaving as a compressible fluid rather than following Bernoulli's principles, had been documented in wind tunnel research. But wind tunnels in 1937 could not replicate 400-mile-per-hour flight conditions. Johnson consulted Theodore von Karman at the California Institute of Technology and other leading aerodynamicists. Their advice was consistent: design conservatively, test thoroughly, and expect problems at speeds approaching 6/10 the speed of sound. The Army accepted Lockheed's design in June 1937. The XP-38 prototype first flew on January 27, 1939. Lieutenant Benjamin Kelsey, Army test pilot and project officer, discovered immediately that the Lightning was unlike any fighter he had flown. The twin-boom configuration, with engines mounted on extended nacelles and the pilot sitting in a central pod, created handling characteristics that defied fighter pilot intuition. The counter-rotating propellers eliminated torque, meaning the aircraft tracked straight without the asymmetric thrust effect single-engine fighters experienced. But this symmetry had a cost. In a dive, there was no torque to help roll the aircraft. The P-38 required pure aerodynamic force to change attitude, and at high speeds, those forces began behaving in ways engineers did not fully understand. The prototype crashed in February 1939 during a transcontinental speed record attempt. Kelsey survived, and the Army ordered 13 YP-38 service test aircraft in April. Through 1940 and into 1941, test pilots explored the Lightning's performance envelope. The aircraft exceeded every specification: 420 miles per hour in level flight at 25,000 feet, climb rate of 4,000 feet per minute. But during high-speed dive tests, pilots reported disturbing symptoms: tail buffeting, control stiffness, a tendency for the nose to tuck under, steepening the dive beyond pilot input. On May 9, 1941, Major Signe Gilkey encountered what would become known as the P-38's defining characteristic. Diving his YP-38 from 30,000 feet, Gilkey reached an indicated airspeed of 320 miles per hour. The tail began shaking violently. The nose dropped until the dive approached vertical. Gilkey hauled back on the control wheel. It barely moved. The elevator, the control surface governing pitch, had lost nearly all effectiveness. Gilkey was, in the parlance of 1941 aviation, along for the ride. He remained with the aircraft, maintaining slight back pressure on the locked controls. At 15,000 feet, as air density increased, control authority gradually returned. Gilkey recovered using elevator trim tabs, small secondary surfaces that could exert force the primary elevator could not. He landed safely and filed the report that should have halted P-38 production. It didn't. The problem was documented but not understood. Lockheed engineers theorized tail flutter, structural resonance, weight distribution issues. The Army needed fighters. Germany had conquered France. Britain stood alone. Arguments over mysterious control problems in high-speed dives seemed academic when German U-boats were sinking cargo ships faster than America could build them. Production continued. The first combat-ready P-38s entered service in late 1941. By December 7th, when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, 69 Lightnings had been delivered to the Army. The United States was at war, and its newest fighter had a fatal flaw that neither Lockheed engineers nor Army pilots could explain. The explanation required physics that had been theorized but never practically applied to aircraft design. As an aircraft approaches the speed of sound, air flowing over curved surfaces, particularly wings, can accelerate to transonic speeds even while the aircraft remains subsonic. At approximately 670 miles per hour at sea level, air pressure waves can no longer propagate ahead of a disturbance faster than the disturbance itself. This is Mach 1, the speed of sound. An aircraft flying at 400 miles per hour at 30,000 feet, where air is less dense and sound travels more slowly, might experience airflow over its wing surfaces reaching Mach 0.9 or higher. At these speeds, air ceases, behaving as an incompressible fluid. Shock waves form. Pressure distribution across the wing changes fundamentally. The center of lift, normally located at approximately 1/4 chord from the wing's leading edge, moves aft toward the trailing edge. For the P-38, this shift in lift distribution had catastrophic effects. As the center of lift moved rearward, it created a nose-down pitching moment that overwhelmed the elevator's corrective force. Simultaneously, the shock wave disrupted airflow over the tail surfaces, reducing elevator effectiveness precisely when maximum authority was needed. The pilot experienced this as locked controls. He could move the wheel, but the elevator barely deflected, and what little deflection occurred produced almost no aerodynamic force. The nose continued tucking under, the dive steepened, airspeed increased. The problem compounded itself until the aircraft descended into denser air where speeds dropped below the compressibility threshold. If the pilot survived long enough to reach thicker air, recovery was possible. If German soil arrived first, recovery was irrelevant. Through 1942 and into 1943, P-38 pilots learned this sequence through experience, that most expensive of teachers. Dive at your own risk. Follow an enemy into a steep descent, and you were gambling that you could recover before altitude ran out. German fighter pilots, receiving intelligence from crashed Lightning wrecks and captured pilots, began to understand something remarkable. The feared American fighter, with its massive firepower concentrated in the nose, 4 50-caliber machine guns, and one 20mm cannon converging at a single point, could not pursue them in the one maneuver that had defined air combat since 1914. The dive. By 1943, Luftwaffe tactical doctrine explicitly addressed the Lightning. If engaged by P-38s, perform the first half of a split S, the classic escape maneuver, where a pilot rolls inverted and pulls into a vertical dive. The Lightning cannot follow. American pilots, aware that pursuit meant possible death, hesitated. That hesitation, measured in seconds, was enough. By the time the Lightning pilot decided whether to commit to the dive, the German aircraft had gained separation impossible to close. The fastest fighter in level flight had become an aircraft from which enemy pilots could reliably escape. The psychological impact on American pilots was profound. They flew the most technologically advanced fighter in the European theatre, equipped with superchargers that maintained power at altitudes where German engines gasped, armed with firepower that could disintegrate a target in a 2-second burst. Yet they could not exploit the fundamental tactic of energy fighting, convert altitude advantage into killing speed through a dive attack. Lockheed understood the problem by late 1941, shortly after Gilkey's report. But understanding the problem and solving it were separate challenges. Kelly Johnson and his team needed data that didn't exist. They needed to test scale models in wind tunnels at speeds approaching Mach 1. The National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, predecessor to NASA, operated high-speed wind tunnels theoretically capable of reaching the required test velocities. But NACA administrators feared damaging their expensive equipment. They refused Lockheed's requests. For 17 months, through 1942, Johnson pushed for access to high-speed test facilities. NACA maintained their refusal. Lightnings continued rolling off production lines. Pilots continued discovering compressibility limitations. The gap between what engineers suspected and what they could prove widened with every lost aircraft. Finally, in late 1942, after personal intervention by General Henry Hap Arnold, commanding general of the Army Air Forces, NACA relented. Lockheed shipped a 1/9 scale P-38 model to the Ames Aeronautical Laboratory at Moffett Field, California. Engineers mounted the model in a wind tunnel capable of Mach 0.9. They duplicated the flight profile that had nearly killed Gilkey. The results confirmed what Johnson had suspected. At Mach 0.68, shock waves formed over the wing's upper surface. The center of pressure shifted dramatically aft. Elevator authority degraded by 70%. The problem wasn't the aircraft, it was physics. The P-38 was encountering the sound barrier's outer edge, a realm where air's compressibility fundamentally altered aerodynamic behavior, and unlike German fighters, which had thicker wing sections that delayed shockwave formation until higher speeds, the Lightning's thin, high-speed wing reached compressibility onset earlier. The wind tunnel data revealed the problem. It didn't solve it. You can't redesign a wing on aircraft already in production. You can't retrofit 3,000 Lightnings with new wing sections. Johnson's team needed a band-aid solution, something that could be added to existing aircraft without major structural modification. Through early 1943, Lockheed engineers tested various concepts. Dive brakes, like those on German Stuka dive bombers, would slow the aircraft but didn't address the pitch control problem. Modified elevator surfaces provided marginally better authority, but not enough. The breakthrough came from understanding what actually needed to change. The problem wasn't speed per se. German fighters could dive faster. The problem was that the P-38's wing, at high speed, was generating lift distribution that created an uncontrollable nose-down moment. What if they could modify that lift distribution? Not slow the aircraft, but redistribute aerodynamic forces to restore pitch control? In February 1943, Lockheed engineers tested small hydraulic flaps mounted on the wing's lower surface, outboard of the engine nacelles. When deployed, these flaps extended 35 degrees downward in 1.5 seconds. They didn't act as speed brakes in the traditional sense. Instead, they disrupted airflow over the wing's lower surface in a way that moved the center of pressure forward, counteracting the nose-down pitching moment caused by shockwave formation on the upper surface. Test pilots flying modified P-38Js at the Lockheed facility in Burbank reported immediate results. Control authority in high-speed dives remained adequate. The nose-down tuck was manageable. They could dive, pull out, and live. Lockheed test pilot Tony Levere, already famous for being one of few pilots who had deliberately flown a P-38 into compressibility and recovered, tested the modified aircraft extensively. Levere pushed the dive flap-equipped Lightning to indicated airspeeds approaching 600 miles per hour, far beyond what unmodified aircraft could survive. The dive flaps worked. The question was whether they would reach combat units before the P-38's reputation became permanently tarnished. The answer was no, and the reason involves a British fighter pilot, a misidentified American transport, and 200 modification kits that would never reach their destination. March 14, 1944. Somewhere over the English Channel, a Douglas C-54 Skymaster transport climbed to cruising altitude, bound for England from the United States. In its cargo hold sat 200 carefully packaged modification kits, each containing the components necessary to transform a standard P-38J into a dive-capable fighter. Hydraulic actuators, mounting brackets, electrical wiring harnesses, installation instructions. 200 kits represented 200 Lightnings that could finally pursue German fighters into dives. 200 pilots who wouldn't need to watch Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs escape with impunity. The shipment was desperately needed. Intelligence reports from the 8th Air Force in England painted a grim picture. P-38 units were being systematically avoided by Luftwaffe fighters who had learned the Lightning's weakness. When German pilots did engage, they broke off combat by diving, knowing pursuit was suicide for American pilots. The C-54's pilot maintained steady course and altitude, standard operating procedure for cargo flights crossing occupied Europe. But over the Bay of Biscay, a Royal Air Force fighter pilot spotted the four-engine transport. From a distance, the C-54's silhouette resembled another four-engine aircraft, the German Focke-Wulf 200 Condor, a long-range maritime patrol bomber that had been sinking Allied shipping throughout the Battle of the Atlantic. The RAF pilot, following doctrine for engaging enemy aircraft over water, dove to attack. The C-54, unarmed and unable to defend itself, fell in flames into the sea. All crew members died. 200 dive flap kits, representing months of engineering work and millions of dollars in development costs, sank to the channel floor. The friendly fire incident would remain classified for decades. Officially, the kits were simply reported as lost in transit, but at forward bases across England, P-38 pilots continued flying aircraft that couldn't dive, while Lockheed scrambled to manufacture replacement kits. The delay would prove catastrophic for the Lightning's reputation. Through March, April, and May of 1944, German pilots continued exploiting their tactical advantage. American pilots continued dying in unrecoverable dives or watching enemies escape. And the modification that could have changed, everything sat at the bottom of the English Channel. Back at Lockheed's Burbank facility, production crews worked to accelerate replacement kit manufacturing. But the dive flaps required precision components. Each hydraulic actuator needed to extend the flap panels exactly 35 degrees in exactly 1.5 seconds. Too slow, and the pilot couldn't deploy them quickly enough in combat. Too fast, and the sudden pitch change could overstress the airframe. Quality control couldn't be rushed. Through spring 1944, P-38Js rolled off the production line and were immediately towed to outdoor modification areas, where crews installed dive flaps by hand. The process was inefficient, exposing aircraft and workers to weather, but it was faster than halting production to retool the assembly line. Finally, in June 1944, Lockheed incorporated dive flaps into the production sequence. The last 210 P-38J models, designated P-38J-25LO in military nomenclature, came equipped with factory-installed dive recovery flaps and hydraulically boosted ailerons. These aircraft represented what the Lightning should have been from the beginning. Test pilots reported dive speeds approaching 600 miles per hour with full control authority. The compressibility problem, while not eliminated entirely, had been managed to the point where tactical utility was restored. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. But by June 1944, the European air war had fundamentally changed. On June 6, D-Day, Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy. The invasion succeeded partly because Allied air superiority had been established through months of brutal aerial combat. That air superiority had been won primarily by a different fighter, the North American P-51 Mustang, which had entered service in the European theatre in December 1943. The Mustang didn't suffer from compressibility issues. Its Rolls-Royce, Merlin engine, license-built by Packard, provided better high-altitude performance than the Lightning's Allison engines. And, critically, the Mustang's range exceeded even the P-38's impressive endurance. With drop tanks, a P-51 could escort bombers to Berlin and back, a mission profile that had seemed impossible in early 1943. By September 1944, 3 of the 4 P-38 groups in the 8th Air Force had converted to Mustangs. The 55th Fighter Group, first to fly Lightnings over Europe in October 1943, transitioned to P-51s in July. The 20th and 364th Fighter Groups followed. Only the 479th Fighter Group retained P-38s through late summer before they too received Mustangs in September. The Lightning's window of opportunity in Europe had closed. The dive flap modification arrived too late to matter strategically, though for individual pilots who received the updated aircraft, it mattered immensely. Second Lieutenant James Kunkel flew one of the improved P-38Js with the 370th Fighter Group, operating from France in support of ground forces after D-Day. On September 16, 1944, Kunkel experienced firsthand what the dive flaps made possible. His flight was providing top cover for squadrons conducting low-level ground attack near Aachen, Germany. Kunkel, flying as number 4 in the last flight, spotted German fighters positioning for an ambush. Multiple gaggles of Focke-Wulf FW-190 and Messerschmitt Bf 109, fighters from Jagdgeschwader 26, the elite Abbeville boys, were diving toward the American formation from the 6 o'clock position. Kunkel broke into them, alerting his formation through his violent maneuver since his radio transmission couldn't reach his flight leader. The German fighters, expecting the standard Lightning response of hesitation or refusal to pursue into a dive, committed fully to their attack. But Kunkel's P-38J-15, recently modified with dive recovery flaps, followed them down. At speeds approaching 450 miles per hour in a steep dive, Kunkel deployed his dive flaps. The aircraft remained controllable. He lined up on a Focke-Wulf and fired his nose-mounted armament, the concentration of 450 caliber machine guns and one 20mm cannon converging at a point. The Focke-Wulf disintegrated. The German pilots broke their attack, confused. Lightnings didn't pursue into dives. Their intelligence, their tactical doctrine, their combat experience all said the P-38 was helpless in high-speed descents. Yet here was an American fighter, matching their dive angles and speeds. Kunkel engaged multiple targets, trading altitude for speed, using his dive capability to maintain offensive positioning. German fighters that attempted their standard escape maneuver, the split S into a vertical dive, found themselves still under attack. The tactical equation had reversed. What had been a guaranteed escape was now a death trap. Kunkel's Lightning took hits. German cannon shells walked up his left wing, penetrating fuel tanks. Fire erupted through the cockpit ventilation system, a blowtorch of flame that seared his face, neck, and hands. But he maintained control through the dive, using the speed to separate from his attackers before pulling up and heading for friendly territory. He crash-landed in Allied-controlled France, suffering severe burns but alive. His mission report documented the first combat engagement where a P-38 successfully pursued German fighters through their primary escape maneuver. The report confirmed what test pilots had been demonstrating for months. The dive flaps worked in combat conditions, but Künkler's success came in September 1944, 15 months after dive flaps had been proven effective. And in testing, 6 months after the modification kits had been lost in the Channel, and at a point when the Lightning was already being phased out of European service. The tactical advantage the dive flaps provided would have been decisive in late 1943 or early 1944, when P-38s were the primary long-range escort fighter over Germany. By fall 1944, most German fighter pilots weren't aware the Lightning's weakness had been corrected because most P-38s had been replaced by Mustangs. German pilots who had survived combat against early model Lightnings maintained their tactical doctrine based on outdated intelligence. Franz Stigler, a Luftwaffe ace with 28 kills who flew Bf 109s against P-38s in North Africa and Europe, later described the Lightning as a formidable opponent that could turn inside German fighters and climb away from them rapidly. But he also noted the reliable escape method. The best defense was to flick roll the Bf 109 and dive, as the Lightning was slow in the first 10 degrees of roll, and it was not as fast in a dive. Stigler's assessment was accurate for P-38 models through the J-20 variant. It was completely wrong for J-25 and later models. But most German pilots never encountered the improved Lightnings in sufficient numbers to revise their tactical doctrine. Herbert Kaiser, eventually credited with 68 aerial victories, shot down his first P-38 in January 1943. He later stated that the Lightning should be respected as a formidable opponent, faster and more maneuverable than his Bf 109 G6, especially after the German fighter was slowed by underwing cannon pods. But Kaiser, like Stigler, operated primarily in the Mediterranean theatre, where P-38s remained in service longer, but where dive flap modifications arrived later than in England. His tactical experience, formed against early model Lightnings, remained valid throughout most of his combat career, simply because improved models arrived too late to matter operationally. Colonel Johannes Mackey Steinhoff, based in Sicily, engaged P-38s throughout the Mediterranean campaign. He acknowledged that while his Bf 109 could fly faster in level flight, a Lightning could turn tighter and get on his tail faster than expected. But he also noted that diving remained a reliable escape option. Steinhoff survived the war and later became Chief of Staff of the Luftwaffe in the West German military. In post-war interviews, he expressed surprise learning that dive flap modifications had been developed in early 1943. From his perspective, the Lightning's dive limitation remained constant throughout the war because the aircraft he encountered never demonstrated improved capability. This gap between engineering reality and tactical perception created a unique situation in military history. A critical weapon system flaw was corrected, but the enemy never fully realized the correction had occurred. German tactical doctrine, formed against early model P-38s, remained viable not because it was correct, but because the corrected aircraft arrived too late and in too few numbers to force a doctrinal revision. Luftwaffe pilots continued teaching new fighter pilots that Lightnings couldn't dive, and they continued being right in most encounters, because most operational Lightnings in Europe through 1944 were early J models without dive flaps. The modifications' late arrival had cascading effects beyond individual combat engagements. American strategic planning for bomber escort missions through late 1943 assumed P-38s would be vulnerable to diving attacks from German fighters. Bomber formations were routed to minimize time over heavily defended areas where Luftwaffe fighters could exploit the disowned Lightning's weakness. These routing decisions cost fuel, limited target options, and increased overall mission risk. When Mustangs began replacing Lightnings in early 1944, mission planners could finally route bomber streams more directly because the escort fighters didn't have the same tactical limitation. But those months of restricted routing, dictated by the P-38's compressibility problem, had already shaped the strategic bombing campaign's evolution. Pilot training also reflected the dive limitation. P-38 pilots in the European theatre were explicitly taught to avoid following German fighters into steep dives. This defensive doctrine was tactically sound for aircraft without dive flaps, but psychologically damaging. Fighter pilots trained to be aggressive, to pursue enemies relentlessly. Teaching them to break off pursuit when the enemy dove created hesitation that affected decision-making even in situations where pursuit might have been survivable. Some pilots later reported that they had hesitated to engage German fighters at all if the tactical geometry suggested the enemy could escape by diving. This hesitation, born from justified caution about compressibility, reduced the P-38's overall combat effectiveness beyond the actual physical limitation. When dive flap-equipped Lightnings finally reached combat units in meaningful numbers, retraining pilots to exploit the new capability proved challenging. Months or years of ingrained caution about high-speed dives couldn't be erased by a technical briefing and a test flight. Pilots who had survived compressibility lockups, who had watched friends die in unrecoverable dives, didn't trust the modification immediately. They had to relearn aggressive dive tactics while unlearning survival behaviors that had kept them alive. This psychological transition took time that operational realities in mid-1944 didn't permit. Most Lightning units transitioned to Mustangs before their pilots fully exploited the dive flap's tactical potential. The Pacific Theater told a different story. P-38s dominated the Pacific Air War in ways they never achieved in Europe. American ace Richard Bong scored 40 aerial victories flying Lightnings, more than any other American pilot in any theater. Thomas Maguire achieved 38 victories, also in P-38s. The Lightning's twin-engine reliability over vast Pacific expanses, its long range, and its heavy firepower made it ideally suited for the theater's unique requirements. Japanese fighters, primarily the Mitsubishi A6M0 and Nakajima Ki-43 Oscar, were supremely maneuverable at low speeds but relatively slow and lightly built. They couldn't exploit the P-38's dive limitation the way German fighters could because Japanese tactical doctrine emphasized turning combat rather than diving attacks. When dive flaps began reaching Pacific P-38s in late 1943 and early 1944, they enhanced an already successful aircraft rather than correcting a critical flaw. Pacific Lightning pilots could now pursue the occasional Japanese fighter that attempted a diving escape, but this situation arose less frequently than in Europe. The modification's primary benefit in the Pacific was increased confidence. Pilots knew they could dive aggressively during ground attack missions without risking compressibility lockup. This psychological advantage translated into more aggressive tactics and better mission effectiveness, though the operational impact was less dramatic than it would have been in Europe if the modification had arrived earlier. The story of the P-38's dive flaps is ultimately a story of timing. The right solution arrived at the wrong time for the theater where it mattered most. 15 months separated successful testing from widespread deployment. In those 15 months, the Lightning's reputation in Europe degraded from promising new fighter to specialized reconnaissance aircraft. Mustangs filled the role Lightnings should have filled, and German pilots maintained tactical doctrine based on a flaw that had been corrected but never effectively communicated through combat results. For the pilots who flew dive flap-equipped Lightnings, the modification was transformational. For the strategic air campaign over Europe, it was irrelevant, arriving after decisions had been made and aircraft had been replaced. The P-38 Lightning entered service as America's most advanced fighter. It left frontline service in Europe having never fully demonstrated its potential, defeated not by enemy action, but by the physics of compressibility and the bureaucratic delays that prevented its correction from reaching combat units when it could have mattered most. German pilots never knew that the tactical advantage they exploited for 2 years had been engineered out of existence months before the war ended. They simply knew that Lightnings couldn't dive, and for most of them, for most of the war, that knowledge remained accurate even after it became obsolete. April 18, 1943. Over Bougainville Island in the South Pacific, 18 P-38 Lightnings executed what would become the most famous long-range interception mission of the Second World War. Their target was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack and commander of the combined fleet of the Imperial Japanese Navy. American intelligence had intercepted and decrypted Japanese communications, revealing Yamamoto's flight schedule. The admiral would be traveling in a Mitsubishi G-4M Betty bomber, escorted by 6 Zeros, flying a precisely timed route that American planners could exploit. The mission required P-38s because no other American fighter possessed the range to fly from Guadalcanal to the interception point and return. 435 miles each way over open ocean. The Lightnings flew at wave-top altitude to avoid detection, navigating by dead reckoning and maintaining radio silence. Captain Thomas Lanphier and Lieutenant Rex Barber led the killer section. When they spotted Yamamoto's flight, the P-38s climbed to attack. Lanphier engaged the Zero escorts while Barber pursued the Betty bombers. Both Bettys were shot down. Yamamoto died in the jungle when his aircraft crashed. The mission succeeded because the Lightning could fly farther than Japanese planners believed possible, and because, at the altitudes where the engagement occurred, compressibility wasn't a factor. The Yamamoto mission illustrated the P-38's fundamental paradox. It could accomplish missions no other fighter could attempt, yet it carried a flaw that made it vulnerable in specific tactical situations. In the Pacific, where missions required range and where enemy fighters couldn't exploit the compressibility weakness, the Lightning excelled. In Europe, where German fighters had learned to exploit that exact weakness and where the Mustang could match the Lightning's range, the P-38 became increasingly obsolete despite its theoretical superiority in other areas. By late 1944, the strategic situation in Europe had shifted dramatically. The Luftwaffe, once a formidable opponent with experienced pilots and modern aircraft, was degrading rapidly. Fuel shortages limited training for new pilots. Experienced aces were being killed faster than they could be replaced. Allied air superiority was so complete that German fighters often couldn't reach American bomber formations before being intercepted by escorts. In this environment, the P-38's compressibility problem mattered less because aerial combat itself was becoming less frequent. The 9th Air Force, focused on tactical ground support rather than strategic escort missions, retained P-38s longer than the 8th Air Force precisely because ground attack missions didn't require the high-altitude diving engagements where compressibility lockup was most dangerous. The 474th Fighter Group, flying P-38s with the 9th Air Force, conducted their first combat mission on April 15, 1944. They were soon joined by the 367th and 370th Fighter Groups. These units operated primarily in the fighter-bomber role, attacking German ground targets in support of Allied advances across France. For these missions, the Lightning's twin-engine reliability and heavy payload capacity were advantages. A P-38 could carry 2,000 pounds of bombs, twice what most single-engine fighters could manage, and if one engine was damaged by ground fire, the pilot could potentially reach friendly territory on the remaining engine. But even in the ground attack role, the dive flap modification proved valuable. Dive bombing attacks required steep descent angles to improve accuracy and reduce exposure to anti-aircraft fire. Without dive flaps, P-38 pilots had to limit their dive angles to avoid compressibility. With dive flaps, they could attack more aggressively. Lieutenant Colonel Howard Nichols, commander of the 370th Fighter Group, demonstrated this capability in July 1944 when he led a P-38 flight against Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge's headquarters. Nichols dove steep enough to skip a 500-pound bomb through the front door of the building. The attack succeeded because his dive flap-equipped Lightning maintained control authority throughout the attack profile. The modification's impact on ground attack missions was significant but difficult to quantify. Mission reports rarely specified whether an aircraft had dive flaps installed, and success or failure in ground attack depended on numerous factors beyond aircraft capability. But pilots who had flown both configurations reported increased confidence when attacking heavily defended targets. The psychological effect was perhaps as important as the actual performance improvement. A pilot who knew he could dive steeply and pull out safely was more likely to press an attack than one who feared compressibility lockup. By March 1945, the 367th and 370th Fighter Groups had transitioned to P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs respectively. The Lightning's service in the European theatre was effectively over. Between October 1943 and March 1945, P-38s in Europe had flown 130,000 sorties with an overall loss rate of 1.3%. This compared favourably to the P-51's 1.1% loss rate in the same theatre, especially considering that Lightnings operated during a period when the Luftwaffe was still relatively strong, and that many Lightning sorties occurred before the dive flap modification was widely available. The numbers suggested the P-38 hadn't been the failure some post-war assessments claimed. But numbers don't capture reputation. By war's end, the Lightning was remembered in Europe as a specialized aircraft, excellent for reconnaissance but inferior to the Mustang as a fighter. This reputation persisted despite the dive flap modification having solved the primary tactical limitation that had generated the negative assessment in the first place. Perception, once established, proved difficult to change even when the underlying reality had shifted. In the Pacific, where the P-38's reputation remained sterling, the war ended before the aircraft's full potential could be demonstrated. Japan surrendered in August 1945. American pilots had been preparing for an invasion of the Japanese home islands that would have required every available long-range fighter. The P-38, with improved L models featuring uprated engines and all the modifications that had been developed through years of combat experience, would have been central to that campaign. But the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August 6th and 9th made the invasion unnecessary. Richard Bong, America's highest-scoring ace with 40 victories, all in P-38s, didn't survive to see the war's end. On August 6, 1945, the same day the Hiroshima bomb was dropped, Bong was killed testing a Lockheed P-80 jet fighter at Burbank, California. The irony was profound. He had survived hundreds of combat missions in Lightnings over the most hostile territory in the Pacific, only to die in a test flight of the aircraft that would replace the P-38 in the jet age. His death symbolized the Lightning's own transition from frontline fighter to historical artifact, a transition that occurred with unexpected suddenness once the war ended. Post-war analysis of the P-38's combat record revealed patterns that weren't obvious during the conflict. In the Pacific theater, where dive flaps had been less tactically critical, P-38s had destroyed more Japanese aircraft than any other American fighter type. Over 1,800 enemy aircraft fell to Lightning pilots, with more than 100 American pilots achieving ace status flying the type. In the European theater, where dive flaps should have been most important, P-38s were credited with 266 aerial victories against 101 losses in air-to-air combat. The kill ratio was respectable but not exceptional, especially when compared to Mustang and Thunderbolt units operating in the same period. What the numbers couldn't capture was the timing problem. Most P-38 aerial victories in Europe occurred in the Mediterranean theatre, where Lightnings operated from Italy against German forces in southern Europe. These units received dive flap modifications later than England-based units, yet they achieved better results, partly because the Mediterranean tactical environment differed from Northern Europe, and partly because German fighter quality in the south was generally lower. By the time dive flap-equipped Lightnings were common in England-based units, the air war's nature had changed. German fighters were scarce, and when they appeared, they often avoided combat rather than engaging. The modification that could have been decisive in 1943 became an unused capability in 1944. The legacy of the P-38's compressibility problem extended beyond the specific aircraft. The dive flap solution, developed urgently to save a troubled fighter program, contributed to broader understanding of high-speed aerodynamics. Kelly Johnson and his team at Lockheed had pioneered practical solutions to transonic flow problems years before Chuck Yeager broke the sound barrier in the Bell Zone in October 1947. The data Lockheed accumulated testing dive flaps informed post-war supersonic aircraft design. The P-38 had been an inadvertent testbed for aerodynamic principles that would dominate the jet age. Other aircraft encountered similar problems. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt suffered from compressibility issues, though less severe than the Lightning's due to its different wing design. Republic engineers studied Lockheed's dive flap solution and developed their own version. The Vought F-4U Corsair, a Navy fighter, also experienced high-speed dive problems that required modification. Across the American aircraft industry, the P-38s compressibility crisis drove research that advanced the entire field. The Lightning's problem became everyone's education. German engineers, examining captured P-38s, initially didn't understand the dive flap mechanism's purpose. Intelligence reports from early 1944 described the flaps as possible dive brakes, similar to those on Stuka bombers. Only gradually did German technical intelligence realize the flaps addressed a compressibility problem. By then, Germany's strategic situation had deteriorated to the point where the information had little practical value. Luftwaffe pilots continued teaching tactics based on the Lightning's dive limitation because most Lightnings they encountered still had that limitation. The few encounters with dive flap-equipped aircraft were dismissed as anomalies or attributed to pilot error rather than technological improvement. This intelligence failure, minor in the context of the war's outcome, illustrated how tactical doctrine can persist beyond the conditions that created it. German pilots who survived the war and later discussed their experiences often expressed surprise learning that the P-38's compressibility problem had been largely solved by mid-1944. From their perspective, the Lightning remained dive-limited throughout the conflict because that's what their combat experience consistently demonstrated. The gap between engineering reality and battlefield perception remained unclosed. American test pilot Tony LaVia, who had been instrumental in developing and proving the dive flap modification, spent months in early 1944 touring P-38 bases in England, demonstrating the improved aircraft's capabilities. He flew a specially modified Lightning named Snafuperman, equipped with all the latest improvements. LaVia's demonstrations were impressive, pushing the aircraft through maneuvers that would have been fatal in earlier models. But his tour coincided with the loss of the modification kits in the Channel. Pilots watched LaVia's demonstrations and then returned to flying unmodified aircraft, knowing the capabilities he demonstrated weren't available to them. The demonstrations intended to boost morale, instead highlighted the gap between what the Lightning could be and what most pilots were actually flying. LaVia's tour took on an almost cruel irony. He arrived at bases telling pilots their compressibility problems were solved, demonstrating impossible dives and recoveries, then departed, leaving those pilots to fly aircraft that still couldn't safely follow German fighters into dives. When replacement kits finally arrived months later, many of those pilots had already been killed or had transitioned to other aircraft types. LaVia's tour became a symbol of the P-38 program's broader tragedy: solutions that arrived too late or not at all, demonstrations of potential that combat pilots never realized, and a reputation damaged by problems that had been fixed but never effectively communicated to the enemy. The P-38 Lightning production ended in August 1945 with over 10,000 aircraft built. Of these, approximately half had been manufactured with or retrofitted with dive recovery flaps. The other half, built between 1941 and mid-1944, carried the compressibility flaw throughout their service lives. This ratio, half corrected and half flawed, reflected the modification's timing. It arrived at the midpoint of the Lightning's production run, early enough that many aircraft benefited but late enough that many didn't. For the German pilots who had learned to exploit the Lightning's weakness, the war ended without them fully understanding that their tactical advantage had become obsolete. Franz Stigler, Herbert Kaiser, Johannes Steinhoff, and dozens of other Luftwaffe pilots who survived the war carried memories of P-38s that couldn't dive. Those memories shaped post-war assessments of Allied aircraft. When aviation historians interviewed German aces in the 1950s and 60s, gathering oral histories while memories were still fresh, the consistent testimony described the Lightning as fast and heavily armed but vulnerable to diving attacks. That testimony, accurate for early model Lightnings, became historical record despite being obsolete by mid-1944. The story of the P-38's dive flaps is ultimately a story about war's chaotic relationship with technological progress. Engineering advances don't translate smoothly into tactical advantage, solutions take time to implement, and that time occurs within a strategic context that constantly shifts. By the time a problem is solved, the war may have moved on, rendering the solution irrelevant regardless of its technical merit. The Lightning's dive flaps worked perfectly. They arrived too late. Both statements are true simultaneously, and together they capture something essential about technological warfare. Victory doesn't always go to the side with the best solutions. Sometimes it goes to the side whose adequate solutions arrive when they're needed most. The P-38 Lightning flew into history as an aircraft of contradictions. The fastest fighter that couldn't dive until it could. The longest-ranged escort that was replaced by an aircraft with even longer range. The most successful American fighter in the Pacific that struggled in Europe. The aircraft whose critical flaw was solved but remained famous for that flaw regardless. And perhaps most tellingly, the fighter whose enemy never learned its weakness had been corrected, allowing that enemy to maintain tactical confidence based on outdated information for years after reality had changed. German pilots never knew. That may be the most important fact of all. They never knew that the tactical advantage they exploited so successfully from 1943 through 1945 had ceased to exist somewhere around June 1944. They continued teaching new pilots to dive away from Lightnings. They continued executing that maneuver when it was still effective and when it wasn't, unable to distinguish between the two because both resulted in escape. The modification that changed everything changed nothing in German perception. And in war, where perception shapes tactical decisions, that meant the modification might as well not have existed for all the strategic impact it had on the European air campaign. The dive flaps arrived, the war moved on, and the Lightning's reputation, established in those critical months before the modification reached combat units in meaningful numbers, remained fixed in historical memory as the fighter that couldn't follow enemies into dives. That reputation, based on aircraft that represented only half the Lightning's production run and describing a problem that had been solved, nevertheless became the accepted historical narrative. Truth is what people remember, and what people remembered about the P-38 was the flaw, not the fix. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.